Hello, and welcome to this session on managing fraud risks in charities. I'm Jonathan Orchard, one of the partners at Sayer Vincent. Thank you very much for joining me. In the next 30 to 40 minutes, I'm going to be making the case as to why I believe every charity owes it to their donors and, more importantly, to their beneficiaries to manage fraud risks and to help ensure that charitable resources are applied to deliver the social impact they're designed to fund and not lost to fraud. And ultimately, that there is something for every charity to be doing to help ensure that this is the case. I'm going to start by considering how big an issue charity fraud is. Now, if I'm honest, we don't know how much is lost to fraud. There is no reliable source or means of estimation. What we do know, though, is that the figure has to be in the many millions, and some estimates put it in the billions of pounds each year. So we do know that this is a substantial sum. But then, as anybody who's been the victim of fraud knows, it's not just the money that matters. It's not just about the lost income. There's reputational risk. There's the loss of confidence that may arise in a charity that suffers from fraud, the general sense of betrayal and loss of trust within an organisation. And I've certainly seen relatively small frauds in terms of pounds lost, resulting in charities collapsing for this lack of trust and confidence that happens as a result. So I think we have to be thinking about more than just the pounds. A question that I'm commonly asked is whether charities are more or less at risk of fraud than maybe a commercial organisation. My usual response is that I think the difference is that they face different kinds of risks. So they may be there may be no greater vulnerability, but that there are different risks at play within a charity that have to be considered. So we have to think about risks around fundraising and grant-making activities and things like this, which do. So there are some common fraud risks, but there are some very charity-specific fraud risks. Fraud's been a big focus of the Charity Commission in recent years. They put fraud awareness at the centre of much of their external communications. I fear potentially that the level of this almost leads to some scaremongering and potentially results in a loss of trust in the sector overall. But there's no doubt that they've produced some useful guidance material on the subject and invested in surveys and reports that do help the sector to build their fraud defences. Now, I'll be quoting some statistics as we go through from the Charity Commission's 2019 fraud survey. And also in its annual compliance reporting, the Commission has been sharing its experiences of frauds that have been reported to it through the serious incident reporting regime. And a recurring theme coming out of those reports, and a view that I share, is that charities continue to be vulnerable through a culture of excessive trust at the expense of what might be smart internal controls. So I think this trust versus controls tension is a very difficult one, I think, for charities to get right. I'm recording this in September 2020, when we're just hopefully coming through the biggest impacts around COVID-19 pandemic. It has seen an increase, particularly in cyber frauds, and a heightened awareness as a result. It's also proved some challenges to some of the charity basic internal controls as we've moved into a remote working environment. And we've got Charity Fraud Awareness Week. It's happening in every October. It's happening again in 2020 in a few weeks' time, organised by the Fraud Advisory Panel alongside Charities Against Fraud. And I'll refer back to Charities Against Fraud in some signposting at the end of this session. So what I'm going to do is talk through a 5-step plan to managing fraud risk. And note that I'm referring here to managing the risk, not prevention. We can't eliminate fraud. Many talk about zero tolerance, but that implies that we have limitless resources that can be applied to tackling fraud, and that's not the practical reality. We don't have limitless resources. We can only apply the available resources we have as smartly as possible to reduce the risk, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on. So the 5-step plan. The first, accepting that fraud exists. The second is around understanding each organisation's own vulnerabilities, building awareness and the right organisational culture, Number 4 is reviewing and assessing controls. And number 5 is reporting and taking action. And I'm going to go through each one of those 5 in turn. But note the order that I put culture ahead of controls. That's key for me because developing the right organisational culture is, in my view, more powerful than the internal controls themselves. As we all know, internal controls can be avoided if a fraudster is determined to. So step 1, as I said, this is acknowledging the existence and scale of the risk itself. And that, as I said, is where the Charity Commission have been very helpful. They've ultimately made it okay for charities to use the F word rather than to keep their heads down and pretend that fraud doesn't exist. In the survey that I referred to, the Charity Commission said that 69% of charities think fraud is a major risk to the charity sector. Unfortunately, many of those didn't see the risk as significant in their own organisation, but it's still a start. 69% think that fraud is a major risk. So some examples that we're going to look in more detail. The first one now is the dominant CEO. And these are, we can point to real life examples where charities have suffered frauds in these scenarios. We've got a dominant CEO that's not held in check or accountable to the board of trustees. We've got the trusted, hard-working finance manager, potentially with the CEO who's not from a finance background, doesn't know the right questions to ask, and therefore has to place that extra trust and confidence in the finance staff. We've got the board of trustees, the little gaggle of people on the right there, because yes, we have indeed seen trustees committing fraud. In fact, 10% of the frauds reported in that Charity Commission survey were committed by trustees. Largely, I assume, smaller charities where trustees are more hands-on in terms of financial management. But the report cites one example of the treasurer of a large charity defrauding it of over £800,000. We've got fundraising, skimming off from fundraising collections, fraudulent collections. How do you know you're getting the income that's due to you? And I mentioned that with obviously in the current environment with remote working and everything else, the increase in cyber fraud, phishing emails, changing supply details, and ransomware. We've just seen Blackboard, the company behind the Razor's Edge software that so many charities use as their fundraising database, being subject to a ransomware attack. So we've got plenty of examples that lead us to be able to accept that fraud exists in charities. So step 2, as I said, is about understanding your vulnerabilities. And this for me is about undertaking a fraud risk assessment. Do you know where you are most at risk of fraud? Because actually recognizing this and putting those risk areas down on paper in a fraud policy is in itself a very powerful deterrent. It says to a potential fraudster, we know and understand our vulnerabilities, we've got our eyes open. So where might your vulnerabilities be? I subscribe to the saying that to beat a fraudster, you need to think like a fraudster. So you need to think, how would I defraud my charity? We put on the slide there some of the common areas of fraud, common areas of vulnerability. Any payment to individuals, so payroll and expenses. Procurement, we've seen that particularly in the international environment, procuring large amounts of humanitarian aid and things like that. We've got risks in procurement processes, but we also have procurement in things like social housing activities. Fundraising activities, grant making, we've touched on. Cyber risks, we've touched on as well. So these are all common areas of vulnerability that start you thinking, but you've also got to think about, well, what might be different or unique about our charity or the subsector of the charity sector that we work in. So here I've got a slide, different charities equals different risks. So there's no one size fits all across the charity sector. So grant making trusts, we've got potential manipulation of grant applications. In international NGOs, the geographically dispersed operations much harder to manage. Branch structures, where we have charities with thousands and thousands of volunteers and lots of local bank accounts, all sorts of scope there for, albeit small scale fraud, but still, as I said, it's not always about the pounds. Social care providers got very complex payrolls, managing service users' money. Again, the service users' money, an example of small amounts of money, the charity's been entrusted to manage that money on behalf of their beneficiaries, and abuse of those funds obviously has significant reputational impact. And retail operations, thefts of stock, we've got cash, we've got shoplifting, we've got things like that to think about. So it's very different depending on either the subsector you're in or the way that an individual charity is structured. So step 3 is about building awareness and developing the right culture. And as I've said, I think this is one of the critical pieces, and one where there is a lot more work that can be done in the charity sector generally. First one there, openly discuss the risks. And here I go back to using the F word. Talk about fraud in the organisation. Demonstrate that it's an important risk for your organisation to be managing effectively. Tone from the top, it's all about trustees leading by example. Show that trustees should show that they care about fraud, because they should be asking questions. The Charity Commission's come up with a one-pager of the questions trustees should be asking about fraud in their charities. Again, that's downloadable from the Charity Commission website. Genuine accountability, so accountability over trust. Being held to account does not imply a lack of trust. It's trustees doing their duty. Management should be encouraging trustees to ask those appropriate questions. We need fraud, bribery and corruption policies that set out not just where an organisation might be vulnerable, what it's doing about it, but the processes in which it will take and the action it will take and the stance it will have should allegations of fraud arise. We talked about cyber security and the CEO impersonation email, for example, asking for payment to the finance manager on a Friday afternoon when they think that their guard is down. But these key messages, you send out key. How do you protect yourselves from that sort of risk? Well, you send out a message throughout the organisation that says, we will never ask for payment by email. If you say we will never ask for a payment by email, we'll go through the recognised payment processes and payment channels. Then if anybody receives one of those emails, they'll know that it's a scam. Spread the word. Make sure that that everybody sees it as part of their responsibility to whistleblow, to, if in doubt, question it. To say if something doesn't quite smell quite right, it quite possibly isn't quite right. And this isn't about making every staff a policeman and having everybody watching over everybody else. It's not about that. It's just about the right appropriate culture that everybody is on the lookout for the best interests of the organisation. Whistleblowing, as I touched on, in my experience, the most common route to discovering fraud is through whistleblowing, often not through the formal policy, yet a policy does need to be in place. Because that sets the tone, the expectation, and demonstrates to staff again that whistleblowing in the right way and with the right motivations is the right thing to do. And according to that Charity Commission survey, just 30% of charities have a whistleblowing policy. So there's more that can be done there. Step 4 is all about considering the right balance of controls. I talked about needing to have the smart controls that are important to counterbalance the environment of trust. So the controls we're thinking about here are those that were necessary to manage the risk of fraud happening and identifying it if it did happen. So we've got a set of preventative controls and we can have a set of detective controls that stop it from happening and will spot it if it has happened. But before considering those controls, I think it's helpful to think through the circumstances that give rise to fraud. And the fraud triangle helps us do this. The 3 points of the triangle are the conditions that are in place in the vast majority of fraud cases. So starting at the top there, first up, motivation. So most people who resort to fraud start as fundamentally honest people. Then something happens, often personal pressures, might be personal debts, often financial difficulties, that leads them to consider fraud. So we're looking at motivation and the warning signs that people might be under pressure, because that motivation to commit the fraud in the first place has to be there. So we need to be thinking about motivation and understanding potential for some of these pressures, personal pressures that people might be under. Secondly, the fraudster's looking for an opportunity, some vulnerability in the systems and controls that the fraudster can exploit. And over-reliance on trust is a good example of that. It provides the fraudster with an opportunity. So we need to be focusing on controls that reduce those opportunities. And the third condition in the bottom right-hand corner there is rationalization. And this is what goes on in the fraudster's head. that rationalises in their own mind why committing a fraud is okay. Now, we might want to think that actually in the charity sector, that's a much harder thing to rationalise. Why would I defraud a charity? We will see in some of the examples that follow how the rationalisation can play out. Potentially, you can with an element of justification. I've got brief scenarios now then of 5 circumstances that can and indeed have led to charity frauds. And in each of these cases, we'll consider some of the measures that could be used to manage the associated risk. The first example I have here is the one of the dominant CEO. So this is the CEO that controls every part of the organisation. It really is his or her organisation. They might be the founder of the organisation. And the trustee board is there really just to ratify what the CEO asks or wants. So the opportunity in this scenario is obvious. The CEO has access to everything and nobody challenges them, and they can exploit that opportunity. Now, the rationalisation that I've seen in this circumstance is the sense of entitlement. So the CEO might have built that charity up from nothing and yet be being paid at a level that they don't think is fully reflective of that. So they have this entitlement. The charity owes me because I've built it to be such a successful organisation and I'm paid a modest charity CEO salary. And that is what has underpinned, I think, many of the charity sector CEO frauds. Now, I don't know the ins and outs of all of these, but a fairly recent example of a charity CEO fraud was at Age Concern South Tyneside, which I think were the losses in that were around about £600,000, something like that, through all sorts of different ways in which the CEO was able to access money. But I suspect that was very much a dominant CEO who had a sense of entitlement. So how can this risk be managed? It's more about organisational culture than anything else, because we know that the CEO would be in a position to circumvent controls should they be so inclined. So trustees need to be holding the CEO properly to account. We've talked about that already. Proper accountability. Need an open organisational culture where staff feel empowered to challenge things if they think things are being done wrong. And there needs to be that whistleblowing channel and a sensible range of controls that segregate key responsibilities and don't give the CEO that unfettered access. And lifestyle changes. Well, this reoccurs, but that warning sign. And I was reading about another CEO fraud that happened in Gloucestershire, I think probably now, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, where all the lifestyle changes were there. The CEO had bought a holiday home and turned up in the charity car park in an Aston Martin, all these sorts of things. You know, the signs are often there in retrospect, and we need to be on the lookout for these things. The second example is what I call then the trusted finance manager. And this, I do think there's a particular charity sector specific risk that plays out here, because in the corporate sector, most CEOs come through the finance route and were finance directors. They're financially savvy people. And with all due respect to charity CEOs, I'm not saying they're not financially savvy, but most haven't come through the finance route. Most come up through the programmatic type routes. And arguably as a result, charity CEOs have to place greater reliance on their finance director than I would argue a corporate CEO does. And I think that in itself poses a risk to the charity and an opportunity to the trusted finance manager. Now, I did one of these fraud seminars back in the day when we did them face to face, and I posed the question to the audience that day, what is your greatest fraud risk? And a man in the front row put his hand up and he said to me, I am. He said, I can access all aspects of the charity's finances. I'm completely trusted and not subject to any real scrutiny beyond and above the annual audit. And many a charity fraud has happened in that kind of scenario. So how do we manage that risk? There does need to be some form of skilled or informed oversight. If not from the CEO, then potentially from the trustees, maybe from the treasurer. So if you think about that payroll, we have a classic control at many charities where a complex payroll report is put in front of the CEO for a counter authorization. Yeah, the finance staff have prepared it, or maybe an outsourced provider's prepared it, and the finance people are giving it the once over, and the CEO, it arrives on the CEO's desk for the final sign-off. Does your average CEO know what they're looking at in a complex payroll report? Is that that final sign-off really an effective control? Often, I would argue, it probably isn't. So we need to be thinking about that. We need to be finding segregation of duties, not just in the payment cycle, where I think it's usually accepted. You wouldn't have the finance manager doing every step of the payment run, including raising, signing off the invoice, processing it, making the payment, accounting for the transaction, etc. But we need it also within the accounting records. Who's checking the bank reconciliations? Who is checking other balance sheet control accounts are reconciled? If a finance manager is going to hide a fraud, they're going to hide it in that sundry creditors account sitting on the trial balance that nobody ever looks at, nobody questions, and can just be used as a convenient place to be putting any bogus transactions. There are ways of doing these things, and we need to be thinking about how we can protect ourselves in these sorts of scenarios. Modern accounting systems, talk about audit trails. Modern accounting systems contain detailed audit trails of who logged on to post what, at what time, etc. And that could be a really, really powerful tool. But quite often these reports just aren't even being accessed, let alone looked at. And they're certainly not seen as an effective, as a useful control, whereas actually there's some really valuable control data in them. And lifestyle changes would come into play again. So I said that it might seem unlikely, but that trustees can pose a fraud risk as well. There was an example, a publicly reported example of a treasurer of a small charity who was trusted with the charity's credit card and built up some personal debts, used the credit card to pay off some of those debts, and used the rationalisation that it was only ever a loan. There was always the intention that money would be paid back, therefore it was okay to do. So rationalisation again can come to play. Well, I was only taking it on a temporary basis to help me through a personal crisis. I would always have made it good. But quite often what happens in the fraudster's mind, once that opportunity's worked, once it's happened a few times, these things can snowball and become much bigger issues. I was asked just the other day about whether a small charity should have credit checks on a proposed neutral treasurer. I said probably not, but that other accountability controls need to be in place. And really what those other accountability controls are really is just the basics of good governance. And what's on there is no more. On that slide there is no more than good governance. Having a code of conduct that, oddly enough would say it's not okay for a trustee to commit fraud, but having clarity of responsibilities, declarations of interest, because actually that's where frauds can come to pass for trustees, is about not managing potential conflicts of interest, and where their personal interests they might be able to exploit for those interests for personal gain, and ultimately having trustees who are able to hold each other to account. So we mustn't forget trustees. And the final two are more about external risks. So those first three are looking inside the organisation. I could have extended one that might have included volunteers as well. Mustn't forget them in the mix. But these final two are external fraud threats for charities. And fundraising, that's an inherent fraud risk that arguably is unique to charities. So how do you know who is out there fundraising in your name and how much are they collecting? Did they really collect the amount that they paid over to you, or have they skimmed some off the top? Now, many of the big charities have fallen into some large skimming frauds where you're using paid or fundraising agents collecting on your behalf. And the most public of which was probably Help the Heroes, who suffered a significant fraud. I think it was down in Devon, somewhere in the West Country, a few years ago, on fundraising skimming. These things can start very innocently. So someone sells a handful of raffle tickets to members of their family and forgets to pay the money on to the charity. That can happen. But for a fraudster, that then says, ooh, opportunity. The charity never came back and asked me for that money. So if I then apply for some of their raffle tickets again and sell more, then there's an opportunity there for me to exploit. So how do we manage these sorts of controls? Well, the basic one there is that you need to know who you've sent fundraising materials to. You need to know who's got what raffle tickets. You need to know who's applied to for one of your fundraising kits to run a coffee morning or things like that. So you can then follow up and ask them for the money afterwards, and keep pestering them for the money afterwards until they have to make a formal declaration that said, no, we didn't go ahead, we didn't raise any money, didn't sell any tickets, send me the books back. Follow up so control over the fundraising materials and follow up. Any significant fundraising event these days will have some sort of web activity on social media, etc., attached to it. So you can use things like Google Alerts to know who's running events in your charity's name to keep tabs on where there might be money coming through, and then to be able to follow up and say, how was that event? Where's the, is there some money coming through? You've got to show that you're smart. You've got to show that you're on top of this and doing everything that you can to get that money. You still might not get all the money, but it's about reducing the risk, and it's about showing to somebody who might be minded to defraud you that you're not the right charity to defraud. So this isn't an unmanageable risk. There are things that you can do. And finally, the fifth one is around cyber fraud. And as I said at the outset, this is one that's been very much on the rise since the onset of COVID-19. I'm including here both the phishing emails, the impersonation of the CEO, etc., and some of the bigger risks around ransomware. And for sure, managing these risks does need the right technical solutions. So on there, I put virus protection. I've put proper password controls, minimum access requirements, only giving people access to bits of the system that they need, because the more routes into your system, the more threats there are, the more risks there are. Firewalls, antivirus, they're all important things. Have charities underinvested in the security of their IT systems in the past? I think quite possibly. Has this been a weak link in charities? I think possibly. I think GDPR helped in many of these areas, that things like minimum access requirements, so some of the controls which are good for GDPR compliance also protect us in terms of cyber fraud risks as well. But that's the techie side of all of this. Now, we know that the fraudsters in cyber fraud area, the cyber fraud experts out there, are one step ahead of all the software solutions. So no matter how much you invest in keeping the virus protections up to date and all that side of things, cyber fraudsters, we know, are smart, and we know they can find ways in, and they're always developing their ways in. So managing cyber risks also requires human vigilance. And that's where the first point on there is by far and away, and probably the most important, is the role for awareness raising. Helping staff, volunteers understand what a dangerous email looks like and what to do if you receive one. Because we all know it only needs one person to click on one rogue link on one email to cause major problems. So people have got to understand what those risks are. The awareness raising has to be there. Still amazes me to hear about people who fall for this, and it worries me that I'm going to do it one day, because these routes in are becoming more and more sophisticated and more convincing. The final step of the 5-point plan is all about taking action and reporting. Now, if your fraud policy says that you will take all necessary actions available to you should you discover a fraud, then that's what you must do. There's no point saying that you'll have a zero tolerant approach, that you'll do everything within your power to follow up and take serious action against fraudsters if you don't then follow through and do just that. Otherwise, you're essentially leaving yourself with an open goal to other fraudsters. You'll be seen as a weak link. So, do you have a fraud response plan in place? It might seem an unnecessary extra bit of paper to be knocking around, or an extra policy document on the intranet, but fraud happens so rarely. We would hope that fraud happens in most organisations very rarely. So it's important to have the key steps written down for reference should the worst happen, and critically making sure that you take appropriate advice. Particularly, I'm thinking about HR advice if allegations are made against staff members, for example. What you don't want is a fraudster to be able to turn back and say, well, you didn't follow employment law. I'm going to take a grievance out over you and take you to an employment tribunal and all the rest of it, and you have to pay them money when they took money from you. And it's happened. So taking appropriate advice is critical. It's also important to know what your reporting requirements are. Now, the Charity Commission survey said that of the frauds reported by the organisations in that survey, 42% just reported those frauds to the police, and just 29% to the Charity Commission. Now, they're worryingly low figures, and it's no wonder that the Charity Commission is so anxious if there are 70% of charity frauds out there that they don't get informed about. So you need to know the serious incident reporting processes to the Charity Commission. You need to be thinking about reporting things to the police. Action fraud, if it's a cyber crime, a cyber fraud attempt, they're the ones piecing together these networks of cyber fraudsters, and reporting to Action Fraud does give you the crime number and things which you would need for your insurers or to demonstrate to your banks that you've done the right things, and some other things to be thinking about: insurers, donors, media, and your external auditors as well, should you suffer from a fraud, or the people you might want to be reporting to. And also remember to learn lessons. And the final stat, I think, the penultimate stat potentially from our survey. Our survey says 73% of organisations in the survey changed their processes as a result of the frauds that they suffered. So 73% of the organisations that had suffered from a fraud changed their processes as a result. And if there's one thing I want you to take out from listening to this, is that there's something that everybody can do to improve their systems, but that in the vast majority of cases, that only happens once you've been hit by a fraud. And actually a little bit of investment of time and thought before a fraud happens could protect you from it happening to you at all. I've got some signposting of resources. Go to the Charity Commission website, you put Charity Commission fraud into a search engine, you'll get a lot of their detail. That's a link there to an April 2018 report. The survey that I've been talking about was an October 2019 report. But Charities Against Fraud, the second link on there, very much give a plug to them, because there's lots of really useful example documents, fraud policies, a suggested fraud response plan, and things like that available on their website. So please, that is a hugely valuable resource and something to be looking at. CFG produced a Countering Fraud report back in 2016. There's the link to Action Fraud for reporting on cybercrime, and Fraud Advisory Panel, who have done a lot of work also on charity sector fraud, and are the ones behind the Charity Fraud Awareness Week, which I say comes up in October. So most estimates of fraud loss in the general economy come in at somewhere in a range of 3 to 5% typically. So even if fraud losses in the charity sector were just 1%, which would be lower than the usually expected figure in the wider economy, so even if it was just 1%, charity sector income is £80 billion a year. So that's a lot of money lost to the various charitable causes. So if you think about, for every £1 million of charitable income, that's £10,000 lost. That's money that's worth doing something about. And what I've hoped to demonstrate in this webinar is that there are practical things that every organisation can do to manage the risk of fraud. And if you want to discuss what you can do in this regard, then please get in touch. The contact details are there. And thank you for listening today.